Hi, I'm Matt from Versa. Welcome back to another Matt's Chat. And I'm going to do a two-part episode this time to split up a kind of long topic of conversation. So part one is this week, part two will be next week. And initially I was just going to talk about vinyl records and vinyl versus digital and what sounds better and kind of misinformation and things like that about vinyl. And then I realized that I wanted to do quite a bit more background on audio, on audiophiles and sort of audio myths and how audio recording works before getting into vinyl, because I think it's important to have some of that background, and I know not everybody has that kind of technical background. So this week I'm going to talk about sort of the principles of audio recording and a lot of the sort of myths that are perpetuated around audio recording and audio playback. And then next week I'm going to look specifically at vinyl records versus digital and look at the advantages and disadvantages to both, because there are some advantages to vinyl, there's some advantages to digital, and I think it's good to talk about what the actual advantages and disadvantages to those formats are, because there's a ton of misinformation out there about both. So who am I? Why should you listen to me? I'm not an audio engineer in the sense that I don't have a degree in audio engineering. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a scientist. But I am very interested in this stuff, and I have a lot of practical hands-on experience with both recording audio and with audio playback. So 20 years ago, I worked at a local hi-fi vendor, sold a lot of high-end stereo equipment, high-end speakers and things like that. I have built my own speakers. I've built my own amplifiers, very interested in that side of things. I've built my own microphones that I use in my recording studio, built my own microphone preamps. So, I've got that kind of hands-on practical experience. I've also done a lot of recording. I've been either the principal engineer or co-engineer on all of Versa's albums. I've done a couple of albums for other bands and friends' music, things like that. So that's where I'm approaching this from. Somebody who has sort of a general interest in the science of sound, who has a lot of experience hands-on with music playback equipment, as well as a lot of hands-on experience recording audio. So you should never just take what somebody says on the internet as the gospel truth. I definitely will recommend some resources if folks are interested in learning more about this stuff. But that's who I am, that's where I'm coming from, and that's sort of the background from which I am speaking on this topic. So, a few principles I think that we need to establish before we can really talk about this stuff. Sound is physical. In the sense, it's not magic, and I think that's something that is important to remember when you're talking about some of the myths or how sort of audio recording and audio playback work, because there are a lot of things that when you really break it down, people are sort of saying this is magic. It's not magic. Sound waves are a pressure wave. They move in and out like this, and to capture them, you have a microphone with a diaphragm, and when the air moves in and out, the diaphragm moves in and out, and that gets translated into an electrical signal that gets recorded like this. And then if you want to play it back, you send that back through an amplifier to boost the signal so that it can drive a woofer or a tweeter, and that speaker moves like this, and that moves the air, and that's how you get sound playback. So you're taking a vibration in the air into a very thin element that can copy the vibration in the air, convert it into an electrical signal, convert it back from an electrical signal into a vibrating element that vibrates the air, and then you hear the sound. There are a lot of different elements that can affect how something sounds on both the recording end and on the playback end. I'm not going to get too deep into the recording end, except to say that some of the things that I'm going to talk about are myths on the playback end are not actually myths in the recording end, because recording equipment tends to be quite a bit more sensitive than playback equipment. It's more sensitive to noise, in part because you often record very wide dynamic range signals, and you may have to boost quiet parts of the signals quite significantly, like 20 or 30 decibels. So if you have noise that's 80 decibels below the signal, in a playback system, you would almost never be able to hear that. But in a recording system, if you then take that signal and you boost it by 30 decibels, now you've got a problem. Now you can hear that noise much more clearly than you would have been able to before, or hear that distortion much more clearly than you would be able to before. There's also differences in recording in terms of things like using tubes, where tubes are basically little distortion machines. They produce a ton of distortion, which potentially makes them bad for playback, but for recording with a tube microphone, you want to get some of that harmonic distortion when you're pushing that microphone hard, or especially with guitar amps, you want the distortion and you want it to sound a certain way that tube distortion sounds like, and not that solid state distortion sounds like, which is very different. So some of these things I'm going to say, just we're applying them only to playback. We're not applying them to recording. I might do a video on recording one day. So there are a ton of myths and BS out there about how audio works and what's important to make a sound system sound good. And I think we also need to maybe qualify what it means to say something sounds good. There's two different ways you can say something sounds good. One is it reproduces what the artists intended and what the artists heard in the recording studio when they were mixing and mastering the recording. And there is, it sounds good to me. And so I'm not going to talk about it sounds good to me because it's completely subjective. And everybody likes things that sound a little bit different. Whereas reproducing what the artist heard in the recording studio and what the artist intended you to hear is an objective standard. We can talk about that. And the reason I'm not saying there's sort of a third one that people will throw out there that I don't think we want to use as our baseline, which is it sounds real. Because you can't really capture the sound of an instrument in a room and make it sound real without doing a ton of work to it, without adding compression, without changing volume levels, without adding reverb, without doing all kinds of manipulation to it. If you just take a straight off the board recording of a guitar, or straight off the board recording of a voice with nothing on it, and you play it back through your sound system, I promise you will not like how it sounds. It does not sound right. It sounds very strange. And that there's a whole bunch of complicated reasons why that is, around how microphones work, around how our ears work. But we don't actually want to reproduce exactly what the microphone captured. It sounds bad. So what we're actually trying to do is we're trying to take those recordings. Well, and then there's also the whole element of, lots of music is intentionally manipulated so that it doesn't sound real. And lots of electronic music, lots of pop music, there's experimental music with tape manipulations going back to pre-digital. You don't want the artist didn't intend those things to sound real, and they don't sound like any acoustic sound that you could create in the real world. They exist purely in a recording console on a computer. So you can't use that as a standard to talk about, well, it sounds real, because what does that even mean in that context? So we want to use the standard of it sounds like the artist intended, what the artist heard in the recording studio when they were listening back to their mixes and masters. So ultimately, what's going to give us the same sound as what the artist intended us to hear, what's going to reproduce what's on the recording medium, whether it's a vinyl record or a compact disc or a digital stream, as closely to make it sound like it should, is no distortion, no added distortion, no added noise, and flat frequency response. So if you look at the spectrum of sound that you can hear from about 20 hertz to about 20 kilohertz. 20 hertz on the low end, very, very low bass. 20 kilohertz is extremely high, to the point that actually most adults can't even hear it. But and that's the range that we can hear. And you want to reproduce that range flat. You don't, because if you have a big spike or a big dip, you're going to be altering what that recording sounds like. You're going to be boosting some frequencies to make them twice as loud. You're going to be pulling back some other frequencies to make them half as loud. It's going to affect how the recording sounds. It's not going to sound like the artist intended. It's not going to sound like it did in the studio. So flat frequency response, no noise, because you just don't want to add shh. If you've got a system that's producing a lot of noise, or it's picking up electronic interference and you're hearing your phone going bzz, 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 bzz on your recording, We don't want that. We want to hear what's there and not add things that weren't there. Same with distortion. Distortion is basically you have a fundamental tone, and then the octave above that, you're getting spurious extra tones. And an octave above that, you're getting spurious extra tones. And that takes that original sound and it makes it sound bad, mostly. With a few, asterisks, there's a few exceptions to that where we actually do want distortion. But in terms of audio playback, we don't want to be adding any distortion. We want to allow the artist to have put the distortion in the recording and the mixing and the mastering phase, and not adding any more additional distortion that wasn't intended to be there. So your gold standard audio system are speakers that can play the entire spectrum, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, without adding any noise or distortion at whatever volume you want it to be. That's physically impossible, but that's the goal. And you want an amplifier behind those speakers that is able to amplify that original signal across the full spectrum, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, without adding any noise or distortion, as loud as you want it to be. That's much more physically doable. You can't quite do it perfectly, but you can do it close enough. And you want to have a recording medium that's going to copy what the artist heard in the studio and reproduce it for you, again, without adding noise, without adding distortion, and without losing or bumping up any of those frequencies across the audio spectrum. So that's sort of the background. That's the fundamental. That's what we're trying to do. That's what an audio system is. That's what audio recording is, and audio playback is. And there are a lot of snake oil salesmen out there who take advantage of people and tell them that they need certain things to make their sound system sound better that they generally don't need. So one of the interesting things about audio, about music recording or any kind of sound recording, is that you can't do a direct side-by-side comparison in the same way that you can with a visual element. You can put two pictures side by side and you can say that one looks better than that one. You can't play two things simultaneously because they just blur together in your brain. You cannot differentiate them in the same way that if you put two pictures side by side, you have to look at one and then look at the other, right? And you have to change out your amplifier. You have to switch your speakers. There's generally time involved in doing that. And like all of our other senses, we are prone to our senses misleading us. That was one of the other fundamental things I wanted to talk about at the start of this video. I kind of forgot. The other sort of principle that we want to come into this with is I can be fooled. You can be fooled. We can all be fooled. And we can fool ourselves, and we can be fooled unintentionally, and sometimes we can be fooled intentionally. None of us are fallible. Our senses, our brains use all kinds of shortcuts to deal with the amount of sensory information that we're receiving all the time, and to parse what's important and discard what's not important. And there are ways to shortcut those systems in our brain to fool us in ways that are really, really, really effective. In ways that you would not, until somebody says you've been fooled and here's why, and I'll show you how you've been fooled, you would never know you've been fooled. My favorite example of this, I'll put it up on the screen right now. It's a visual, it's an optical illusion. And in this optical illusion, the squares marked A and B appear to be different colors. And, if you just saw this without somebody telling you it was an optical illusion, you'd bet your life that square A is lighter than square B. Square A and B are the same color. They're the same shade of gray. They're exactly the same brightness. And it's a trick of the eye that makes you think that square B is darker. And there are all kinds of audio illusions as well. There was one that went around a couple of years ago. There was the Yanni and Laurel, where the same audio clip played back through different speakers or played back to different people sounded like Yanni to some people and Laurel to other people. And the reasoning behind that was based on what frequencies were being reproduced by the speaker. If you had a laptop speaker or something that wasn't producing some of the high-end frequencies, you were more likely to hear it one way or the other. Also depended on your ears. If you're an older person who'd lost some of their high-frequency hearing, you were more likely to hear it one way. And if you're a younger person who still retained all of their high-frequency hearing, you were more likely to hear it the other. But again, you would hear it as Laurel, and you would say, that's Laurel. And another person would say, no, it's saying Yanni, and they sound completely different. So you can be fooled, and we cannot do a direct side-by-side comparison of audio. Your brain can't process two audio signals at the same time. You have to have one, turn it off, turn the other one on. So you have to rely on your memory. Memory is fallible. And the other thing that often people overlook or don't understand when they're talking about audio is the importance of volume in determining what sounds good to a person. So in order to have a conscious awareness that something is louder, to realize that this sound is louder than that sound, you need a volume difference of about 2 decibels. If something is less than 2 decibels different in volume level, you will not be aware that one thing is louder than the other. But subconsciously, you will still detect it. And there have been some really interesting studies done showing that people will subconsciously perceive the same sound to sound better if it's only half a decibel louder. So if you take an identical recording, 2 exact same waveforms, and you bump the volume on one up by 0.5 decibels, which is quite a bit less than you can consciously perceive, and you listen to those 2 files, you just A/B them, you go, okay, I'm listening to one, I'm listening to the other. The majority of people will pick the one that's slightly louder as sounding better, even though they are in all other respects exactly the same. So the first way in which people get misled by audio is just by not controlling for volume and not controlling for expectation. So humans, we're social creatures, and as I said, we have all kinds of shortcuts in our brain that allow us to parse information quickly. And a big part of how we process information quickly and how we relate to the experiences of other people is expectation. So if I tell you this one sounds better than this one, you are primed mentally, subconsciously, you may not even be aware of it. You are primed. You have an expectation that this one is going to sound better than this one. Whatever these 2 things are, it doesn't matter if it's an amplifier or a speaker cable or a live performance. You will probably, all other things being equal, prefer the one that you've been primed to hear as better. And you will say that one does sound better, even if in fact they're exactly the same. So, and this is expectation bias is very powerful, to the point where if you're auditioning for a role in a symphony, or you're auditioning to attend university to study music at a very high level, your audition will be blind. So you will be behind a curtain, and the people who are auditioning you will not be able to see you. And this is because even people who devote their entire lives to music, and people who are the most trained people in the world at listening to music, at recognizing talent, will subconsciously prefer people who are dressed more professionally, even if they're not as good. You use certain subconscious racial biases, subconscious gender biases, even things like height. They will affect how the people who are auditioning for these very prestigious positions to some of the most knowledgeable musicians in the world are perceived. And so since we have realized, that was realized 30 or 40 years ago, and over the last 30 years, gradually, pretty much every audition for major symphonies, for major music schools and things like that is now done blind, because no matter how much you are aware that bias exists, you cannot overcome it except by removing the expectation bias entirely. So that's an issue where audio myths crop up, is because people say, well, this sounds better than this, and you can't really compare them side by side, and you have these expectations in your head. And then also volume levels can be different. So if you're comparing 2 amplifiers and you don't actually use a multimeter to carefully ensure that the power output from both amplifiers is exactly the same, one amplifier will be slightly louder than the other amplifier just because that's how they work. And you may prefer one amplifier to another without really realizing that that's what's going on, that you're not actually hearing a difference in the amplifier, you're only hearing a difference in the volume level. So just run down a few things that really don't matter. in the grand scheme of things in terms of audio myths. The first one that comes up a lot is cables. And holy smokes, there are people online who will just swear to high heaven that you have to spend $5,000 on your speaker cables or your interconnects, or you're just wasting your time. I recently went and purchased a little WEM amplifier for my den, used off a guy from Facebook Marketplace, and I went over to his place, and he was telling me all about his amazing audio setup. He had $800 speakers connected to a $1,000 amplifier with $3,000 speaker cables, and this is properly insane. This is completely divorced from reality. So you can understand why people might think this would matter, because you're connecting your stereo to your speaker. The signal has to get from the stereo to the speaker over a speaker cable. It would make sense that the cable that's connecting them could affect the quality of the signal that's going from the amplifier to the speaker. And in fact, it can, but in most cases it doesn't. And the reason for this is just a miscalibration in our minds about where we think the difference, what is good enough. So a miscalibration in our minds for what is good enough. So typical copper wire that you might buy at Radio Shack or Best Buy or whatever, 16 gauge copper wire, that is going to carry an audio signal 3 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet from your amplifier to your speaker, 100 or 200 watts, whatever. You crank it as loud as a home stereo will go with zero loss. That is more than good enough to carry that. It's not actually a lot of power. There's no ultra high frequencies that could be subject to things like skin effect or EMF radiation problems, and that you can get into with like 4K video signals and things like that. It's actually music is a very simple signal on the electrical side of things, and you don't need anything more than just basic copper wire. Now, if you took a tiny little strand of aluminum and connected a speaker 6 feet away from an amplifier, you would probably hear a difference, because that little tiny strand of aluminum is probably not sufficient to carry 50 watts of power to the speaker, and it's going to start losing some of the signal. So you understand, it makes sense why this myth would begin, and it makes sense why it would perpetuate, because of what we talked about with expectation biases, with changes in volume level and things like that. And there are certain real life situations where that speaker wire might make a difference. Primarily very long runs. So if you've got your speakers 50 or 60 feet away from your amplifier, then using a heavier gauge cable can really make a difference. It may matter. But in a normal situation where your speaker's 6 feet from your amplifier, you connect the speaker to the amplifier with regular 16 gauge copper cable, it is going to work perfectly, and a $5,000 speaker cable is not going to do anything differently. And you can prove it. You can prove it two different ways. So the first way is you just do a test with sensitive measurement instruments. There are electrical measurement instruments that can test how much of a signal is getting through a cable. And, you basically run an audio signal through a cable and you go 100% of the signal. There's no loss, or the loss is like 0.1%, like way below the threshold of hearing. And you go, okay, there's no difference between these two cables. Then you might say, well, what if the objective tests that we're running, what if the scientific instruments aren't picking up something that our ears are picking up? Okay, that's a fair concern. So the way that you test that, again, is blind testing. Like I was talking about before with auditioning violinist for an orchestra. You want to get rid of those expectation biases, and you want to control for them so that you are not fooling yourself into thinking one thing sounds better than another thing. Because it's very easy to fool yourself, especially when you have to take a minute to disconnect the old wires and connect the new wires, and then sit back down and try and remember what you just heard and compare it to what you're hearing now. Brains are just not very good at doing that. And so what you do, if you want to do an objective comparison of two speaker cables, is you try to set up a system with a switch that will allow you to instantly switch between two speaker cables, and that allows you to do that without knowing which speaker cable you're listening to. You want to check to make sure the levels are the same between the two speaker cables. It's possible if you're comparing like a very fine gauge wire to a very heavy wire, you might get very slight changes in the actual volume output of the speaker, so you want to be able to control for that. And then you just sit there and you switch back and forth and you write down which one you think is better. And you do that 100 times over. You do that with 10 or 15 different people. And when you do those properly controlled tests, where the people conducting the test and the people listening don't know which cable you're listening to, and you're able to switch quickly between them, and you've checked that the levels are the same, never, ever is anybody able to tell the difference between cables on a short run. Occasionally you can on a very long run. You're running 40 or 50 foot cable. Short run, people just fundamentally cannot hear the difference because there's no difference. If there was a difference, you'd be able to hear it in that situation. You'd be able to measure it. You can't measure it. You can't hear it. It doesn't exist. Again, it's not magic. And you get in, occasionally you can get into discussions with people who will be advocating for these speaker cables, and they come up with all these kind of crazy justifications for why there's a difference. And fundamentally what they're saying is it's magic. Is it doesn't obey the same physical laws as every other electrical signal. It doesn't obey the same physical laws that light does, or that anything else might. Heat does. And I think we can just sort of reject those kind of assertions out of hand. So speaker cables, it's all a bunch of nonsense. Just use copper wire. Doesn't matter. RCA cables, just use what came in the box. It doesn't matter. It's the same signal. And if you walk into most high-end recording studios that are actually making the albums you're listening to, and you pull open their patch bays, it's all just generic XLR cable. They're not using anything special. It's started to creep into some studios in recent years, but for decades, you'd go into a professional studio and they'd be like, that crap doesn't matter. Who cares? We don't need fancy power cables, like all of that stuff. And really, this comes down to, you can use the same process I just described for speaker cables for anything else. Generally speaking, a properly designed solid-state amplifier that's not driven to distortion sounds like every other solid-state amplifier that's not driven to distortion. So if you've got a 100-watt amplifier and you're running normal speakers and it's properly designed, it's a Yamaha amp or it's a Denon amp or it's a WEAM amp or whatever, it's going to sound exactly the same as every other amp. Solid-state amps don't have a signature sound. They don't have any sound at all. They're basically just a straight wire with gain until they hit distortion. And most of them that are properly designed, you have to drive them so hard to make them distort. It's never going to happen in normal listening circumstances. And if it does happen, then you don't need any kind of fancy audiophile gear. You just need a more powerful amplifier. That's all there is to it. Where things get really interesting is actually speaker design, because that's the one thing that really, really matters. Cables don't matter. Amplifier doesn't matter. Your source doesn't really matter in terms of like CDs. Digital audio has been a solved problem for decades. And all you have to do is take the digital slices of the waveform that are all like cut up like that and reassemble them so that it makes a smooth wave and not get any of them out of order. That's how you make perfect digital audio signal into an analog signal again. And as long as you do that without getting the slices out of order, then there's nothing else that you can do. The people have like $5,000 DACs. They have $5,000 CD players, these really high-end streamers. Oh, it makes such a difference to your sound quality. You've got your digital slices of the analog waveform. You recombine that digital slice into a smooth wave. You're done. That's all that digital audio is. It's not magic. There's nothing more to it. You sample the physical analog waveform 44,000 times a second in 16-bit words. You reassemble it as a smooth waveform, and you're done. And all the $5,000, $10,000 DACs where people say they make such a big difference, it's the same thing as speaker cables. If you sit down and you A/B a $100 DAC and a $10,000 DAC within a controlled test where you don't know which one you're listening to, you will never hear the difference. And every time this test is conducted, people do not hear the difference. And every time it's done sighted, people hear a difference because they have expectation biases and things are not properly level matched. And so they go, oh, there's a big difference between this thing and this thing. And then as soon as you put that blind down and you can't see what you're listening to anymore, and you've ensured that they're outputting the same level signal, all the differences in the world disappear and they sound exactly the same. So that's sort of my rundown of, it was a little bit all over the place. I apologize. There's so much to cover with this stuff, but fundamentally the point is audio is a physical thing. It exists in the world. It is subject to the laws of physics. We are easy to fool. We need to learn how our brains can be fooled if we want to determine what actually sounds better versus where we're being misled or where we're just having a snake oil salesman sell us junk for $10,000, because that happens. And we can then use that knowledge to make better recordings and use that knowledge to spend our money on audio equipment better, because some of it's crazy expensive, but you can get a really good sounding stereo system for not very much money if you know where to put your money, and you don't waste it on stuff that doesn't matter. So that's part one. Part two, we'll talk about vinyl, we'll talk about CDs. I'll get a little bit more into digital audio and talk about the issues with vinyl, but also why people still like vinyl even though it has issues. So thank you very much. I'm Matt. This has been a Matt's Chat. If you enjoyed it, subscribe. And if you want to listen to some digital audio that's not available on analog, check out any of Versa's recordings that are on this channel. We would really appreciate it, and we hope you enjoy them. Thank you very much.